Sir, step away from that door. What are you doing here?
I'm checking on my neighbor, Mrs. Washington.
I can see damage to this door. You trying to break in?
Listen, you can hear her medical alert beeping.
I need you to move away from this property immediately.
Officer, I'm telling you.
On September 1st, 2021, at 2:47 p.m., Officer Mark Reavers received a routine wellness check call at a Third Ward apartment complex on Magnolia Street in Houston, Texas. What began as one neighbor's concern for another would escalate into a $3.2 million civil rights violation that ended a decorated veteran's career. The Third Ward of Houston carried the weight of history in its red brick buildings and tree-lined streets. Magnolia Street represented the neighborhood's transformation, where decades-old apartment complexes stood alongside newer accessible housing developments. The late summer heat pressed down on the concrete sidewalks, creating shimmering waves of warmth that danced across the pavement. At 95 degrees, the afternoon sun cast harsh shadows between the two-story buildings, offering precious pockets of relief for residents seeking respite from the oppressive Texas heat. Within this close-knit community, neighbors knew each other's routines as intimately as their own family members. Mrs. Eleanor Washington's ground-floor apartment sat adjacent to Carl Davis's specially modified unit, their front doors separated by mere feet of shared walkway. The proximity had fostered an unlikely friendship that transcended generational and cultural boundaries, creating a bond rooted in mutual respect and genuine care. Carl Davis embodied resilience in human form. At 34 years old, his muscular arms spoke to 6 years of navigating the world from his wheelchair, each defined muscle a testament to his refusal to surrender to circumstance. His rich brown skin glistened with perspiration in the humid afternoon air, while his Houston Texans t-shirt clung to his broad shoulders. The workplace accident at 28 that severed his spinal cord had stolen his legs, but failed to break his spirit or diminish his determination to live independently. Before his injury, Carl had worked as an automotive technician, his skilled hands diagnosing engine problems and performing intricate repairs. The transition from working under car hoods to hunching over computer keyboards required months of retraining and adaptation. His apartment reflected this journey, filled with adaptive technology that enabled his work as a freelance computer programmer. Multiple monitors lined his desk, while voice recognition software supplemented his typing when fatigue set in. The Third Ward community had embraced Carl not as an object of pity, but as a valuable neighbor whose technical skills proved invaluable to residents struggling with smartphones and computer problems. His reputation as the neighborhood's unofficial tech support spread quickly, earning him respect and genuine friendships throughout the complex. Children would wave enthusiastically when his wheelchair appeared in the courtyard, while elderly residents sought his advice on everything from setting up email accounts to troubleshooting television connections. Mrs. Washington occupied a special place in this informal support network. The 78-year-old retired school teacher had lost her husband of 53 years 3 years prior, leaving her alone in an apartment that suddenly felt cavernous. Carl had noticed her struggle with isolation and initiated their daily 1 o'clock conversations, a ritual that provided structure and comfort for both participants. Their friendship transcended their differences in age, race, and physical ability, grounded in shared values of community and mutual support. The accessibility modifications in Carl's apartment told the story of careful planning and hard-won independence. Lowered countertops, widened doorways, and specialized bathroom equipment enabled him to maintain his dignity while managing daily tasks. His wheelchair, a lightweight model with custom modifications, served not merely as mobility equipment, but as an extension of his identity and autonomy. Within this supportive community environment, the stage was set for an encounter that would shatter the peaceful routine and expose the dangerous intersection of racial bias and disability discrimination lurking beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Officer Mark Reavers carried himself with the measured confidence of a man who had served his community for 12 years, without questioning his methods or examining his assumptions. His personnel file painted the portrait of a model officer, decorated with commendations for community policing initiatives and praised by supervisors for his dedication to duty. The reality beneath this polished surface told a far more troubling story, one that the Houston Police Department had systematically ignored despite mounting evidence. The military precision that had served Reavers well during 2 tours in Afghanistan translated awkwardly to civilian policing, particularly when dealing with vulnerable populations who required patience rather than tactical dominance. His rigid adherence to command and control protocols, while effective in combat zones, proved catastrophically inappropriate when applied to disability community interactions. The warrior mentality that had earned him respect among fellow veterans became a liability on Houston streets, where nuance and empathy determined the difference between successful de-escalation and civil rights violations. Internal affairs records revealed a pattern so consistent it bordered on predictable. 7 previous complaints involving excessive force against individuals with disabilities created a roadmap of escalating incidents that should have triggered immediate intervention. In 2018, Reavers forcibly removed a deaf man from his vehicle during a routine traffic stop, interpreting the driver's attempts to retrieve his hearing aids as suspicious behavior. The following year brought 2 separate incidents: the arrest of a blind woman for what Reavers termed suspicious behavior, while she used her white cane to navigate downtown sidewalks, followed by his decision to deploy a taser against a man with cerebral palsy during a mental health crisis call. The pattern intensified in 2020 when Reavers handcuffed a wheelchair user during routine questioning about a nearby burglary, claiming the man's hand movements while operating his wheelchair constituted furtive gestures. That same year, he arrested a veteran suffering from PTSD for disorderly conduct after the man failed to immediately comply with contradictory commands during a noise complaint investigation. 2 additional incidents in early 2021 involving individuals with intellectual disabilities solidified the trajectory that would culminate in his confrontation with Carl Davis. Training deficiencies plagued Reavers' service record like unhealed wounds. His mandatory disability awareness training remained incomplete, overdue by 18 months, despite multiple supervisory reminders. No crisis intervention certification appeared in his file, while his understanding of Americans with Disabilities Act requirements proved rudimentary at best. Supervisor evaluations noted his resistance to disability-specific protocols, describing his attitude as old school and praising what they interpreted as decisive action, rather than recognizing dangerous inflexibility. The Houston Police Department's institutional culture enabled and protected Reavers' problematic approach through willful blindness and administrative inertia. Internal communications revealed a pervasive dismissiveness toward disability-related service calls, with dispatchers and supervisors adopting a frequent flyer mentality that characterized legitimate community needs as nuisances. The lack of specialized units for disability community interactions meant that officers like Reavers operated without oversight or expertise, making critical decisions based on assumptions rather than training. Warning signs accumulated like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, visible to anyone willing to look but consistently ignored by those with the authority to intervene. Community advocates filed formal complaints about Reavers' approach to disability-related calls, while disability rights organizations specifically requested his removal from such assignments. Supervisors acknowledged the pattern, but failed to mandate retraining, protected by union contracts that prioritized officer rights over community safety. Previous settlements involving Reavers remained sealed from public scrutiny, preventing accountability while enabling continued misconduct. The protection offered by police union representation created a culture of impunity that would ultimately cost the city millions while destroying lives in its wake. The afternoon of September first began like countless others in the 3rd Ward, with Carl Davis completing his morning work routine and preparing for his daily 1 o'clock conversation with Mrs. Washington. The ritual had become as essential to his day as his morning coffee, a moment of human connection that anchored him to his community. When 1 o'clock arrived without the familiar sound of Mrs. Washington's door opening, Carl felt the first stirring of unease in his chest. 15 minutes passed before Carl maneuvered his wheelchair to Mrs. Washington's door, calling her name while knocking gently. The silence that greeted him felt wrong, heavy with implication. Mrs. Washington never missed their daily talks, never failed to respond to his calls. Her routine was as predictable as sunrise, making her absence profoundly unsettling. Carl pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear any sound of movement within the apartment. The faint beeping of a medical alert device reached his ears around 1:30, barely audible through the thick apartment door, but unmistakable to someone who understood its significance. Carl's concern escalated into genuine alarm as he realized Mrs. Washington might be in medical distress. He knocked louder, calling her name with increasing urgency, hoping to rouse her if she had simply fallen asleep or was having difficulty hearing. When verbal attempts failed, Carl began using his wheelchair to create more substantial knocking sounds against the door. The rubber bumper on his chair's footrest left small marks on the lower portion of Mrs. Washington's door as he repeatedly bumped against it, each impact accompanied by calls for her to respond. The medical alert device continued its persistent beeping, confirming Carl's worst fears about his neighbor's condition. A neighbor across the courtyard observed Carl's increasingly frantic attempts to reach Mrs. Washington and interpreted the scene through the lens of suspicion rather than concern. The 911 call that followed described a man trying to break into an apartment and causing a disturbance, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever alter multiple lives. The caller failed to mention Carl's obvious disability or his clear distress about his neighbor's welfare. Officer Mark Reavers arrived on scene at precisely 2:47 p.m., his body camera automatically activating as he exited his patrol vehicle. The wide-angle lens captured Carl positioned near Mrs. Washington's door, wheel marks clearly visible on the lower portion where his chair's bumper had made contact. Reavers immediately assumed criminal intent, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon as he approached the scene. The initial contact revealed the catastrophic gap between Carl's reality and Reavers' assumptions. While Carl saw an elderly neighbor in potential medical distress, Reavers perceived a black man attempting to burglarize an apartment. The officer's aggressive posture and commanding tone signaled his predetermined conclusion about the situation, leaving no room for alternative explanations or nuanced understanding. Reavers demanded that Carl step away from the door, seemingly oblivious to the obvious fact that Carl used a wheelchair for mobility. The command revealed the officer's fundamental misunderstanding of disability, treating adaptive equipment as a choice rather than a necessity. Carl attempted to explain his 3-year friendship with Mrs. Washington and their daily conversation routine, but Reavers focused solely on the perceived property damage represented by the wheel marks on the door. The medical alert device continued its urgent beeping throughout their initial exchange, providing audible evidence of Mrs. Washington's distress. Carl repeatedly directed Reavers' attention to this sound, explaining its significance and pleading with the officer to check on his neighbor's welfare. Reavers dismissed these concerns, interpreting Carl's explanations as elaborate excuses designed to cover criminal activity. Critical miscommunication escalated the encounter beyond any reasonable resolution. When Reavers ordered Carl to get on the ground, he demonstrated profound ignorance of paralysis and its effects on mobility. Carl patiently explained his physical limitations, showing the officer his paralyzed legs and describing his inability to comply with the impossible command. Reavers interpreted this medical information as resistance and excuse-making rather than legitimate physical reality. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Carl requested that Reavers check on Mrs. Washington first, offering to submit to arrest afterward if the officer still believed criminal activity had occurred. This reasonable compromise, which would have resolved the medical emergency while addressing law enforcement concerns, struck Reavers as manipulation and non-compliance. His military training emphasized immediate obedience to lawful orders, leaving no framework for accommodation or alternative approaches. Physical confrontation became inevitable as Reavers approached Carl's wheelchair with the intent to forcibly remove him from the scene. Carl instinctively gripped his wheel rims to maintain stability, a defensive action born of years of experience with wheelchair transfers and balance. Reavers interpreted this natural response as active resistance, escalating his use of force accordingly. The forced removal attempt exposed Reavers' complete ignorance of proper wheelchair transfer techniques and the medical complexities of paralysis. Carl offered to demonstrate safe transfer methods to prevent injury to both himself and the officer, but Reavers dismissed this expertise as delaying tactics. The wheelchair tipped over during the struggle, sending Carl crashing onto the scorching concrete sidewalk where the temperature exceeded 100 degrees. Mrs. Washington's medical alert device continued beeping throughout Carl's arrest and transport, a haunting soundtrack to institutional failure and human suffering that would echo through courtrooms for years to come. The medical emergency that Carl had desperately tried to prevent unfolded with tragic precision while he sat handcuffed in a Harris County jail cell. Mrs. Washington's medical alert company finally dispatched emergency services at 4:30 p.m., nearly 3 hours after Carl's initial attempts to check on her welfare. Firefighters forced entry into her apartment to discover the elderly woman unconscious on her bathroom floor, victims of both a stroke and systemic indifference that had delayed critical medical intervention. Memorial Hermann Hospital's stroke specialists worked frantically to assess the damage caused by the prolonged delay in treatment. Medical records would later confirm that Mrs. Washington's stroke had occurred around 12:30 p.m., placing Carl's intervention attempt squarely within the critical window, when immediate medical attention could have prevented permanent disability. Instead, the 4-hour delay between symptom onset and treatment resulted in devastating right-side paralysis and significant speech impairment that would forever alter her quality of life. The cruel irony was not lost on Mrs. Washington's daughter, who arrived at the hospital to learn that the man arrested for trying to help her mother remained in jail on burglary charges. The family's immediate contact with local media and civil rights organizations set in motion a public relations nightmare that would ultimately cost the city millions while exposing the intersection of racial bias and disability discrimination within law enforcement. Carl endured 18 hours in custody before disability rights attorney Maya Rodriguez secured his release on a $50,000 bond that seemed deliberately punitive for nonviolent charges. His detention highlighted the jail system's inadequate accommodation for disabled individuals, from inaccessible facilities to medical staff untrained in paralysis-related care. The bond amount, excessive for someone with deep community ties and no criminal history, reflected the justice system's tendency to punish disability alongside alleged criminal behavior. Local disability advocacy groups mobilized with unprecedented speed and coordination, organizing protests outside Harris County Jail within hours of Carl's arrest. Social media footage of the incident, captured by concerned neighbors, went viral across multiple platforms, generating the hashtag #LawJusticeForCarl that began trending locally before gaining national attention. The visual impact of a paralyzed black man being forcibly removed from his wheelchair struck viewers as particularly egregious, sparking outrage that transcended traditional activist circles. Community fundraising efforts demonstrated the neighborhood's solidarity with Carl and recognition of the injustice he had suffered. Within 48 hours, residents and supporters had raised over $75,000 for legal expenses, far exceeding initial goals and providing concrete evidence of grassroots support for his case. The spontaneous outpouring reflected both affection for Carl personally and broader frustration with police treatment of vulnerable community members. Houston Police Department's initial response followed predictable institutional patterns of defensiveness and deflection. Official statements claimed that standard procedures were followed during a lawful arrest, making no mention of Mrs. Washington's medical emergency or the context that had prompted Carl's actions. The department's refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing immediately placed them at odds with community leaders and civil rights organizations demanding accountability. Officer Reavers was placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation, a routine response that satisfied neither critics nor supporters. The automatic triggering of investigative protocols reflected department policy rather than acknowledgement of wrongdoing, while body camera footage was immediately classified as evidence and withheld from public release. This opacity fueled additional speculation and criticism about potential cover-up attempts. Media coverage intensified as investigative reporters uncovered Reavers' troubling history with disability community interactions. Channel 2's expose revealing 7 previous complaints involving excessive force against disabled individuals provided crucial context that transformed the narrative from isolated incident to systemic problem. The Houston Chronicle's editorial board called for comprehensive policy review, while national disability rights organizations arrived to provide support and expertise. Congressional Black Caucus members requested federal civil rights investigation, elevating the case beyond local jurisdiction and increasing pressure on city officials. The American Civil Liberties Union announced intentions to file Section 1983 lawsuits, while the mayor's office scheduled emergency meetings with disability community leaders in an attempt to contain growing political damage. The federal response arrived with the weight of constitutional authority behind it, as the FBI Civil Rights Division opened formal investigation proceedings within 2 weeks of the incident. The Department of Justice's review of Houston Police Department's compliance with Americans with Disabilities Act requirements signaled federal recognition that local accountability mechanisms had failed catastrophically. A federal grand jury convened to consider civil rights violation charges, ultimately indicting Officer Reavers on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, carrying potential prison time that transformed the case from administrative matter to criminal prosecution. Civil litigation commenced simultaneously with attorney Maya Rodriguez filing a $15 million lawsuit against the city of Houston, the police department, and Reavers individually. The discovery process revealed extensive documentation of institutional failures, from Reavers' complaint history to internal communications showing supervisory awareness of problematic patterns. City insurance carriers, faced with overwhelming evidence of liability, recommended immediate settlement negotiations rather than risking jury trial that could result in far larger monetary damages. Depositions exposed the depth of systemic failures within Houston Police Department's approach to disability community interactions. Expert testimony demonstrated clear violations of both the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. Internal emails revealed supervisors discussing Reavers' issues with disabled individuals while failing to mandate corrective training or remove him from disability-related calls. The documentation painted a picture of institutional negligence that made city liability virtually certain. Settlement negotiations proved contentious and protracted, with initial offers falling far short of addressing the magnitude of constitutional violations and personal suffering involved. The city's opening proposal of $500,000 was immediately rejected as inadequate compensation for Carl's trauma and Mrs. Washington's permanent disability. Mediation sessions revealed potential liability exposure exceeding $10 million when factoring in punitive damages and federal civil rights violations. Houston City Council ultimately authorized settlement negotiations up to $5 million, while Carl's legal team demanded comprehensive policy reforms in addition to monetary damages. The final settlement, reached after 14 months of negotiation, totaled $3.2 million with specific allocations addressing multiple victims and systemic changes. Carl received $2.1 million in compensatory damages, while Mrs. Washington's family obtained $800,000 for delayed medical response that caused permanent disability. An additional $300,000 was allocated to disability community advocacy programs, ensuring lasting benefit beyond individual compensation. The settlement's non-monetary provisions proved equally significant in creating systemic change within Houston's law enforcement approach to disability community interactions. Mandatory 40-hour disability awareness training became required for all police department officers, while a specialized unit was created specifically for disability community interactions. Body camera protocols were enhanced with disability-specific incident flags, ensuring proper documentation and review of future encounters. A civilian oversight board was established with 50% representation from the disability community, providing ongoing monitoring and accountability mechanisms. Annual third-party audits of disability-related police encounters created transparency and data collection that had previously been absent. Most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy was implemented for officers with repeated disability community complaints, preventing future Reavers situations from developing. Officer Reavers faced personal consequences that extended far beyond employment termination. Federal criminal conviction resulted in 18 months of imprisonment, followed by permanent disqualification from law enforcement employment nationwide. Personal bankruptcy proceedings followed as legal costs and civil judgments exceeded his financial resources. Court-ordered disability sensitivity training and community service requirements at local advocacy organizations provided ongoing reminders of his actions' consequences. The case's broader impact transformed policing practices across the nation, with Houston's training program being adopted by 15 other major police departments seeking to prevent similar civil rights violations. Federal legislation was introduced requiring national disability training standards for all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. Carl became a prominent advocate for disability rights and police reform, while Mrs. Washington established a foundation focused on elderly emergency response protocols. The case has been cited in 47 subsequent civil rights lawsuits, creating legal precedent that continues protecting vulnerable community members from discrimination and abuse of power.